Will I ever be able to take a stroll on Everest? Grab a baguette in Paris? And still make it back to New York in time for my morning meeting? It would be kind of cool, though it's still a very distant possibility. But one thing that is certain is that string theory is already showing us that the universe may be a lot stranger than any of us ever imagined.
For example, string theory says we're surrounded by hidden dimensions, mysterious places beyond the familiar three-dimensional space we know.
People who've said that there are extra dimensions of space have been labeled as, crackpots or people who are bananas. I mean, what do you think there are extra dimensions? Well, string theory really predicts it.
What we think of as our universe could just be one small part of something much bigger.
Perhaps we live on a membrane, a three-dimensional membrane that floats inside a higher dimensional space.
There could be entire worlds right next to us, but completely invisible. This radical new theory starts with a simple premise that everything in the universe, the Earth, these buildings, even forces like gravity and electricity, are made up of incredibly tiny, vibrating strands of energy called strings. And small as they are, strings are changing everything we thought we knew about the universe, especially our ideas about the nature of space.
For decades, physicists believed that the tiniest bits inside an atom were point particles. Flying around the outside were the electrons, and inside were protons and neutrons, which were made up of quarks. But string theory says that what we thought were indivisible particles are actually tiny vibrating strings.
It's nothing really mystical. It's a really tiny string. It either closes into its little circle or it has endpoints, but it's just a little string.
Just as the strings on a cello can vibrate at different frequencies, making all the individual musical notes, in the same way, the tiny strings of string theory vibrate and dance in different patterns, creating all the fundamental particles of nature. If this view is right, then put them all together and we get the grand and beautiful symphony that is our universe. What's really exciting about this is that it offers an amazing possibility. If we could only master the rhythms of strings, then we'd stand a good chance of explaining all the matter and all the forces of nature, from the tiniest subatomic particles to the galaxies of outer space.
ولو فتحنا عليهم بابا من السماء فظلوا فيه يعرجون لقالوا إنما سكرت أبصارنا بل نحن قوم مسحورون ولقد جعلنا في السماء بروجا وزيناها للناظرين.
This is the potential of string theory, to be a unified theory of everything.
وجعلنا السماء سقفا محفوظا وهم عن آياتها معرضون.
To solve the problem, Witten constructed a spectacular new way of looking at string theory.
Ed announced that he had thought about it, and moreover he had solved it. He was going to tell us the solution to every string theory in every dimension. which was an enormous claim. But coming from Ed, it was not so surprising.
The atmosphere was electric because all of a sudden, string theory, which had been going through kind of doldrums, was given an incredible boost, a shot in the arm. After Witten's talk, there was renewed hope that this one theory could be the theory to explain everything in the universe. But there was also a price to pay. Before M theory, strings seemed to operate in a world with 10 dimensions. These included one dimension of time, the 3 familiar space dimensions, as well as 6 extra dimensions, curled up so tiny that they're completely invisible. But M theory would go even further, demanding yet another spatial dimension, bringing the grand total to 11 dimensions. For most of us, it's virtually impossible to picture the extra higher dimensions. I can't. And it's not surprising. Our brains evolved sensing just the 3 spatial dimensions of everyday experience. So, how can we get a feel for them?
الذي خلق 7 سماوات طباقا ما ترى في خلق الرحمن من تفاوت فارجع البصر هل ترى من فطور ثم ارجع البصر كرتين ينقلب إليك البصر خاسئا وهو حسير.
We're all familiar with the real world having 3 spatial dimensions. That is, anywhere I go, I can move left, right, back, forth, or up, down. But in the movies, things are a bit different. Even though the characters on a movie screen look 3-dimensional, they actually are stuck in just 2 dimensions. There is no back, forth on a movie screen. That's just an optical illusion. To really move in the back-forth dimension, I'd have to step out of the screen. And sometimes, moving into a higher dimension can be a useful thing to do. So, dimensions all have to do with the independent directions in which you can move. They're sometimes called degrees of freedom. The more dimensions or degrees of freedom you have, the more you can do. That's right. And if there really are 11 dimensions, then strings can do a lot more too.
People found fairly soon that there were objects that lived in these theories, which weren't just strings, but were larger than that. They actually looked like membranes or surfaces.
The extra dimension Witten added allows a string to stretch into something like a membrane, or a brain for short. A brain could be 3-dimensional, or even more. And with enough energy, a brain could grow to an enormous size. Perhaps even as large as a universe. This was a revolution in string theory. The existence of giant membranes and extra dimensions would open up a startling new possibility. That our whole universe is living on a membrane inside a much larger, higher dimensional space. It's almost as if we were living inside a loaf of bread.
يا معشر الجن والإنس إن استطعتم أن تنفذوا من أقطار السماوات والأرض